I would now like to introduce John Esch, who is the Senior Lecturer and Faculty at Large at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. John will moderate and introduce the panelists for our next session.
Morning, everyone. Thank you very much for welcoming me here this morning. It's my pleasure to be here, and I believe that the major part of my job this morning is to stay out of the way. So what I'll do is I'll introduce each of the panel members to you. We'll give each of them approximately 10 minutes to share some of their thoughts and experiences, with a focus on experiences about how to build what we need in our organizations in order to truly integrate our service delivery. So we'll begin with David Court, who's been introduced to you, former CEO or CAO at Algoma, and we'll let him share some of his thoughts with you. And as the panelists come up and join us here at the table, David can take the podium and begin his presentation. So we'll welcome up Brenda Patterson and David's work as well. I'll introduce them more fully later on.
Clock started?
Yes, it has. You can move the mic if you'd like.
Understand that when I've got 2 minutes left, Cleon's going to throw something at me, so I'll try to get started and be very quick. When I was asked to do this, I
Can't hear. Yeah, just closer.
When I was asked to speak this morning, I made it clear I wasn't prepared to talk about any intellectual real approach to integration, but more about the practical issues and things we learned as we proceeded in both in Algoma and in Manitoulin and Sudbury, where I ended up spending a good deal of my time in what was supposed to be my retirement. But that's another story for another day. The Algoma and Manitoulin had quite different starting points. In Algoma, we had basically been involved in the delivery of general welfare programs since 1969. So when the programs got downloaded with an existing board, we had an existing administrative capacity, and we really needed to build it. In Manitoulin and Sudbury, there had been no predecessor boards. The individual municipalities had delivered the general welfare program at that time. So in their case, they were building capacity from a much more disadvantaged location. However, we discovered very early on that the CEO there, Gary Champagne, and myself, had lots in common. We like to eat, we like to drink wine, and we believed in integrated programming. So there was a constant sharing of ideas back and forth. So integration looks very similar in those two locations. They're very similar both in terms of their context, because they're very large geographic areas where we've got pockets of population spread out over some of the worst highways in North America. So we both immediately decided that the way to deliver all the programs was not to set up separate administrative structures for each of them, although they actually came with their own administrative structures, but actually were to blend them together. So from a client's perspective, they'd be dealing with a single person for intake for all three programs, and all three programs would be co-located in the same offices, which would be dispersed across those jurisdictions. So in Algoma's case, we were dealing with 20 municipalities, Manitoulin, Sudbury 18. Now you have to understand that every one of those municipalities has anywhere from 6 to 10 municipal councillors. So it may be hard in Metro Toronto and Peel with your large number of councillors, but in the DSABs it's even more so. And the issues around communication and similar things are all the same, only they're made a little bit more extreme. Both in Algoma and in Manitoulin and Sudbury, the integrated approach was essentially a no-brainer because it was a lot cheaper to do. It was the least expensive option. It made the most sense from where you have low caseloads, low populations, and where they're dispersed. the programs were transferred to us, and in each case we got the programs transferred on a staged basis so that we, although we had to build the capacity in terms of the offices, we built the capacity, as an example, to handle the intake for social housing long before we had social housing actually transferred to us. But it was done on a staged basis, and we were able to do that across the jurisdiction. Had to do a lot of work around the physical plants in terms of enough space to actually handle whatever number of clients were going to be coming through the doors in these very different communities. Overall, the number one lesson that we learned was communications is central to everything. I think it doesn't matter what the change is, communications is at the core of either it working or not working. That communication's got to be consistent, meaningful, and it's got to ensure that all of the partners are involved. So it's the board, the staff, the stakeholders, the funders, and the service providers. So they need to have some way of keeping them current as to where you are in terms of your change process. In this case, it was us assuming programs. Where we failed and when we had problems, when we searched back as to what had gone wrong, it almost always was communication or a lack of communication or the wrong form of communication was used. So I think if you can nail down the communication when it comes to a change, you're going to nail down most of your potential problems. Finding the right communications tool is an ongoing effort. It's ongoing even now in those locations. So we're constantly trying to find ways of making sure that what we're trying to get across, gets read, and gets understood in a meaningful way with a large, very diverse group of people that you're trying to communicate with. We did find that in both of our cases, in particular Manitoulin Submarines, which I'm going to talk about at another session, that if you have highly functional, very content-rich websites, they're very helpful in communicating. However, you've got to have strong IT staff to make sure these things are up and running and that they're laid out in ways so people can find what they're looking for. And in the final analysis, particularly when it comes to municipal funders, you need to meet with them face-to-face. You cannot rely on either written communications or websites or whatever to communicate all you need to. You've got to have face time, particularly with those funders. From program-related level, we found that from the tenant's point of view, it made sense. They know they've got complex problems that can't get solved with a single program. They also know that they don't know all of the things that are out there, so the more programs you can put in front of them to solve their problems, the happier they are. We had worked with some assumptions driving the integration process, that we had a role in facilitating clients having access to programs outside of the 3 programs that we were integrating. And that applicants in the end were going to appreciate, deserve, and expect integrated service. And that the program boundaries, which are so heavy in our minds, are not that clear in the minds of clients. And I think they actually have an intuitive, more integrated approach than the people delivering the programs. In terms of board beliefs, and I think when we talk about board beliefs, it's what the board believes or what you get them to believe is another way of looking at it. But at the end of the day, they came to buy that you can have efficient and effective delivery through integration, that they strongly felt financial eligibility in all the programs needs to get separated from the case management, whether it's Ontario Works, rent-geared income calculations, or child care fee subsidy. And those needed to be integrated but delivered separately. And they agree in what's simply referred to as one-stop shop. And I think I'm out of time, so I'll end there. 2 more minutes? Wow.
If you'd like to continue.
The board also believed that the needs of the customers actually should drive the organization rather than the needs of the organizations. And they also believed, and they're still looking for this one, that Ontario Works, Social Housing, Child are essentially subsidy programs. They need to be more closely integrated at the provincial level. So the provincial level is telling us to integrate, but they weren't doing too much in terms of integrating their approach. And there were tremendous opportunities to do that in terms of data collection, similar eligibility rules, same definitions of who was a spouse across the programs. That still, as far as I know, unless it's happened in the last 2 or 3 years, has still not happened. Although you can get boards to believe things and they become their beliefs, you need to renew that because they'll turn over. And it's an ongoing thing to get boards online with it. But I think what gets them online are specific examples and simple terms. One-stop shop, that they get that immediately. You compare it to going into Canadian Tire. You can get your car fixed, and when you're getting car fixed, you can pick up your gardening supplies and pick up some cleaning. It's all one stop. They get that. I think if you get into very complex explanations of integration theory, you're going to lose them. So they need examples, and they need things that resonate in their own lives. I could talk for hours, but...
For another 30 seconds if you want.
Okay. The goal of the integrated delivery was that the clients, in fact, were going to maximize their social and financial independence. So people coming through the door have a problem. If the only sign on the door is welfare, guess what you're going to deliver to them? If your only sign on the door is social housing, guess what you're going to talk to them about? We try to get away from that. We try to say, we're here to listen to your problems and tell you different ways you might solve them, whether it's the programs we deliver or the programs we can help you access. So the solution might be a Canada pension. The solution might be marital counseling. The solution might be 100 things other than the 3 programs we deliver. So moving away from I'm here as a gatekeeper for a program to a point where I'm your broker and I'm going to find you the program or the services that are going to help alleviate your problems and make you more independent. That is a major shift in terms of how you train staff, how you orientate, and how you orientate your board as well. And it leads to lower caseload, it leads to lower costs. It works.
I think. Thank you, David. Now, we will hear from 2 more of our panelists for approximately 10 minutes each as well. I'll, in a minute, introduce Brenda Patterson to you. You'll also get to hear more from David. He says he can speak for hours and hours, and he'll have another chance because we'll have a chance to ask some questions of our panel. So you'll notice that there's an opportunity for you to ask those questions. There are microphones, et cetera. So we encourage you to think of questions that you believe could help your colleagues here that we could pose to the panel after we've heard from Brenda and from David's work. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Brenda Patterson. Her role with the City of Toronto, she deals with a much larger structure and some of the challenges that go along with that number of employees, the sizes of the budgets, and she'll talk to us this morning about some of those challenges and how she encourages people to participate and get involved with integrated service delivery. Brenda?
Thank you. So David's talked a little bit about an example of how they drove integrated service delivery, and my remarks are going to reflect a little bit more about what are the things that an organization needs to think about as the underpinnings of helping an organization develop the capacity both to deal with change and to approach problems in a different way through an integrated response. So one of the things that I thought about as I was preparing the remarks this morning was the issue that we have at the City of Toronto. How do you take 44 divisions, very large divisions, and have them collaborate? And it struck me as I was doing some of the research that I thought was necessary for this morning, that it's important to look at the cultural drivers in an organization that help to anchor the organization in a way that will allow it to be successful at whatever these changes are. And so those drivers are things like mission, brand, your strategy, measurement, reward, and talent management. And I think it's really critical that you focus on those things to provide direction. And I'll talk a little bit about how that works in some of the examples that we have at the city. The other thing that I think you have to be conscious of all the time are the cultural anchors that actually limit your ability or create barriers for that change. And those are things like the failure of many organizations to address the freedom to act. We often ask people to do things and then put a whole lot of barriers around them that actually make it a foregone conclusion that they're never going to be successful. You also have to address things like the myths in the organization. Oh, we can't do that because we've tried that before. In fact, the longer you've been around, the more likely you've seen various versions of these things that everybody gets somewhat tired of, and that stops action right from the get-go. So you have to address these walls in order to actually help people to move forward. So to me, what that really means is you have to have clarity around shared goals. And David, in his remarks, talked about the importance of having a sense of what those shared goals, objectives, and outcomes are. Without a common understanding and a common commitment to those shared goals and objectives, frankly, you're destined for failure. I think the other thing that oftentimes we fail to do adequately is to articulate the activities, the roles, and the responsibilities of the people who will actually be called upon to implement the change. You have to make people accountable for what they deliver. It actually has to be in their performance contract with the organization, and you have to make sure that somebody's responsible for ultimately delivering either the components or the whole project. And that also speaks to the importance of selecting the right team. You know, if you get a group of people on the team that actually are not interested in driving this change, then the outcome is going to be foregone. That you're not going to have the result that you're looking for. So you need to choose people who are ready to drive that change. It's really important, and I think we do this not enough, to measure results, to start out with something that actually is specific and measurable. If you can't tell if it was done, then in all likelihood, it isn't going to get done. What we measure is what we get. And the other thing that I think is very important, and we often don't do this enough, is that we need to reward and acknowledge the right behavior. What we reward is what we get. So if you want behaviors that are all about integration and joint problem solving and so on, you actually have to find a way to make sure that that's what you get rewarded for, whether it's in the city manager's awards or whether it's in the things that we do to give people recognition in other ways in the organization. So what drives change? What drives change at the City of Toronto? I think actually, in the words of somebody that we probably don't want to remember, you have to sometimes create a crisis to actually have people be motivated to change. So at the city, after a couple of years of 5% reductions and last year 10% reduction and a core service review which looked at what businesses are we in and what level should we do those, should we actually be engaged in those businesses, I think everybody in the various divisions we're incredibly motivated to look at how can we solve some of these problems with a new approach. So the core service review, as I mentioned, looked at what are the businesses we should be in, what are mandatory, what are essential, and at what level do we need to do those services. And it led to a series of other reviews, which we called service efficiency studies. So if you're going to do those things, how should you do them, and is there a better way to do them to be more effective? And those studies have been really, I think, helpful. They have an outside party's perspective coming and assisting the organization, facilitating that dialogue. And those studies are all about integrating services across many parts of the organization. Some of the examples are things like our counter study. So we're looking at the same kind of opportunity that David was talking about. When somebody comes into to a city office, they should be able to have their needs met by the person who meets them at the counter. It almost takes our experience with 311 and brings it to a front-facing counter. And it's going to drive some of the changes. And I think both David Korten and David Swark will talk or have talked about a focus on customers, so I won't spend a lot of time on that, but that's also one of the important elements of driving that change. I think we often underestimate the need for change management. That whole process of driving new ways of doing things requires a significant effort on paying attention to the change management process. And probably one of the most important things that I could offer for you in terms of that is to make sure that you have committed leadership that actually drives that. I'm going to recognize a couple of people in the audience who are really the authors of this. Sue Cork, who's here in her role as registrar for the College of Early Childhood Educators, actually was the former DCM with the city and came up with the term structures of collaboration, which I think, in addition to having a good strategy, clear goals, terrific leadership, you actually have to create structures that drive that change, and you have to assign that responsibility to a committed team who are responsible for that change. The other two people in the audience, Heather McVicker with Toronto Employment and Social Services, and Elaine Baxter-Trahare, our General Manager of Children's Services, are driving some change with an integrated counter for eligibility assessment for both childcare and OW. And obviously for some municipalities, that's not new. For our city, excuse me, that's incredibly new, and it's also very exciting. And we have multiple tables where we've been able to drive this kind of change, both from with essentially an issue that needed a resolution that required more than one division to do it. So I'll conclude my remarks, because I'm running out of time, with just one last comment. I think once you've got that path laid out, you're on your route, the importance of relentless implementation and consistently measuring and checking to make sure you're doing what you said you were going to be doing can't be understated.
What gets measured gets done. Thank you very much, Brenda. A perspective from a very large structure. You mentioned 44 different offices that need to work together. It's now my pleasure to introduce David Zwark. He's currently CAO at Peel Region, and Peel's recognized as a leader in integrative service delivery. And David will give us some of his insights through his experiences there. Perhaps more to do with the human side and some of the thinking and feeling that go along with how difficult this sort of large change can be. David Zwark.
Thank you, John. I have a 40-minute presentation that last night I cut down to 20 minutes, and then I'm going to try and deliver in 10. Ready? So I'm either going to speak very quickly. The thought also struck me that most of the people who work for me only listen to half of anything I say, so I could just read every other line, and it would be just like being back at the office. But I'll try and go through this quickly. And the reason it's long is because, although my remarks you'll see are consistent with those of Brenda and David, I want to drill down into the actual tactics that we use to hoist those cultural anchors and move the organization forward. So to set the context, the integration of the delivery of human services in the region of Peel was really the second part of a larger change that we had started working on about 6 years ago at Peel. It resulted in a major reorganization within the structure of the region of Peel. First time we had reorganized the entire enterprise in 35 years. And ultimately, we reduced the number of departments from 8 to 5, 2 internal-facing support, enabling services, and 3 external client-facing services or departments. And these changes were made across the organization to support an enterprise-wide focus on 3 things: engaging employees, providing exemplary public service, and maintaining the public's trust and confidence in Peel. And the integration of service delivery, not only in human services but across the organization, is key to the success of all 3, I believe. So before we integrated human services in Peel, the services were delivered through a fairly traditional structure: Children's Services, Ontario Works, Employment Services, and Housing Services. They were housed or located in 2 separate departments. Each department, in fact, each service, had their own objectives, their own practices, measures of success. They had their own processes, both front office and back office processes. And in 2007, as part of the reorganization, we brought all of those things together into one human services department. That was the easy part. That was phase 1. Phase 2 is really to integrate the internal and external client-facing processes. What we started out to do and ended up in fact doing was aligning the department and service delivery along functional lines like client access rather than along program lines like childcare and OW. So we took the entire organization and turned it on its side. And this is crucial in my mind to making the service experience integrated and not just stopping at co-locating a variety of services under one administrative structure. The sequence we followed was to integrate the back-end functions first, and we created an integrated business support function within the department. Then we integrated the front client-facing services, and now we're working on integrated case management. So the back-end services were things like IT, finance, training, business process, contract administration, HR, facility management, and so on. As well, before integration, each department also engaged in its own strategic planning, its own policy and research, its own community development for its services, and project management. All of that was going to be amalgamated and be done through an integrated approach. So how do you keep 900, actually more than 900 employees that have come together from quite different service disciplines and experience, focused and engaged? Remember, these people would include people who were superintendents in our not-for-profit housing buildings, OW caseworkers, employment workers, accountants, administrative support staff, policy wonks. If you named them, if you could name them, we had them. And we wanted to make sure that they understood that the integration of service delivery would affect each and every one of them in some way. So one of the things we did at the beginning was we surveyed a sample of the staff in the first year, and we found some interesting things. 1/3 of them said that they feared the loss of their jobs. Yeah, we talk about integration and change in service delivery. Many people read that as code for downsizing and job loss. 1/3 feared that the changes that would come about from integrating work practices and expectations would swallow them up, that they would suddenly become part of the largest group, which was the only unionized group of the lot, and they would lose their own identity and sense of self. And another 1/3 told us, and I think this is really interesting, that they feared that they lacked the skills and knowledge required to perform in the new organization. Brenda's mentioned that leadership is critical to sustaining organizational change, and I can't agree more. So in the structure that we use, the overall decision-making and authority and accountability stayed with the Human Services Leadership Team, and they put in place a dedicated transition project team, some of whom are sitting at that table, and will answer any difficult questions that you can throw at me. Their job was really to manage the implementation of what we tried to do. But it was the visible and enthusiastic involvement and interest of the leadership team that reinforced the fact that the organization was serious about making the changes. The underlying reason for integrating service delivery was to improve the effectiveness in service delivery by centering it on the requirements of the community and the service users. So the first thing we did was develop a human services plan. And the plan was developed with contributions from employees, clients, and the community organizations. Over 700 consultations were held. And what the plan does is really describe the end state that we wanted to achieve for human services. By involving the staff body through a range of different tactics or tools, that was the first part really of the overall change management process. It raised awareness that change needed to occur, and it described the end state that the changes were to achieve. And for some, it gave the sense that the staff a sense of joint ownership in the prescribed changes. Others, Brenda and David have mentioned communication, and we put a lot of energy into communication. We dedicated communications resource to the transition team, and they used a number of strategies. And these strategies included things like describing the client experience. So we didn't describe the process changes, which is so often the subject of internal communication as you go through these kinds of changes. What they did was describe the client experience so that staff could visualize the positive impacts that integration would have on the client. They used a range of visual aids to demonstrate the way that the client experience would change. These took the notion from concept or abstract to tangible. The team developed, as an example, Sam's story, a fictional account of a person seeking a range of services from Peel. Sam's story showed how Sam's experience after integration would be better than the previous pre-integration fragmented experience. Posters, videos, other communication devices were engaged to reinforce the post-integration experience and how that was going to be beneficial to the client, and to convey the message that the reorganization and change of processes were all required if we were to better serve the public. We also used some more traditional methods, unit and department meetings, to bring staff together, to provide updates on progress and also updates on delays when we were meeting our targets. We trained the management team, the entire management team, in a change management methodology. We used ProSci, but you can use anyone. And those communication updates that we did were also used to assess the staff readiness and the understanding of the changes, the staff's understanding of changes as they were rolled out. We also put in place a committee of frontline staff, a multidisciplinary committee that liaised with the transition project team and allowed an additional feedback loop to tell the transition team whether or not the changes were actually working. Peace. I just got a peace sign from Cleona. So now I'm really going to start speaking quickly. They celebrated early successes. One of the tactics they used was voicemails. So rather than sending out memos, the leadership team would send voicemails to staff across the organization explaining some of the positive changes that had happened. So staff actually began to see the outcomes that were predicted were actually happening. We also conducted surveys of employees at key milestones to assess attitudes and opinions and get feedback on how the changes were affecting them throughout the organization. One important point was that employees who were moving to new parts of the organization, so for example, when we created that integrated back office and we're pulling staff from across the organization to do new work in a back office, they were told about the change personally, given job descriptions and given expectations about their new role. They were offered the opportunity for a meeting with their existing and their new supervisor together. We called those warm transfers if they wanted. And we also allowed them to make decisions that affected them as often as possible. So for example, we worked with the union and allowed unionized employees who were moving into a unionized part of the workforce the option of remaining outside of union representation. We did the usual formal training, classroom and peer-to-peer. And finally, we also did other changes across the department to indicate that integration was not just happening at the front office. So we did things like integrated budget development, harmonization and integration of work management practices like flex time and performance management. So integration was seen to affect every aspect of working in the department, not just the front counter. And finally, we talked about performance measures and so on. Just to conclude, we did do a lot of measuring. And the measures give an interesting story. Comparing 2008 to 2012, employees' ratings of their job satisfaction increased slightly, while their rating of commitment to continue to work in Peel dropped by about 5%. So massive change is not for everyone, and integrated service delivery is not for everyone. But the measures also told us that the exercise has had its benefits. During the same period, measurement of customer satisfaction across 10 human services increased by 12% overall. And overall trust and confidence as measured by the general public for the region of Peel stayed stable at about a 7.1 out of 10. Thank you.